Chapter 1 of Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 1. A Creamery Shark. The crows had come back. With the fashionables of Maine, they had gone south for the winter, but now, on the 3rd day of March, the advance guard of the solemn Black Army soared in sight. They were crawling over the green pine woods of North Marsden, they were crawling over the black spruces of South Marsden, and in Middle Marsden, where the sun had melted the snow on a few exposed knolls, they were having a serious and chattering jubilation over their return to their summer haunts. "Land, ain't they sweet!" muttered a little girl, who was herself almost as elfish and impish as a crow. She stood with clasped hands in the midst of a spruce thicket. Her face was upturned to the hot sun set in the hard blue of the sky. The sun burned her, the wind chilled her, but she remained motionless, except when the sound of sleigh bells was heard. Then she peered eagerly out into the road. Time after time she returned to her hiding place with a muttered, "No good." She allowed a priest to go by, 2 gossiping women on their way from the village to spend a day in the country, a minister hurrying to the sick bed of a parishioner, and several loaded wood sleds. But finally a hilarious jingle drew her hopefully from her retreat. Her small black eyes screwed themselves into 2 glittering points as she examined the newcomer. "He'll do!" she ejaculated, then, with a half-caressing, half-threatening, "You'll get murdered if there's a word out of you," addressed to an apparent roll of cloth tucked among spruce branches a few feet from the ground, she stepped out by the snake fence. "Hello, mister!" The fat young man, bobbing over the thank-you-ma'ams of the snowy road, pulled himself up with a jerk in his small sleigh drawn by a long-legged mare. "Coronation! Where did that noise come from? Hello, Woodlark!" as he observed the little girl peeping at him through the fence. "Is there a hawk in your nest?" "Who be you?" she asked. "I've got an awful pretty name," he replied, flicking his whip over the snowbank beside him. "Too pretty to tell." "Who be you?" she asked, pertinaciously. "Ever hear of a creamery shark?" "I didn't know a shark's favorite cream," she said soberly. "They dote on it." "Be you a creamery shark?" "No, course not. I'm chasing one. I'm a farmer." The small, keen-eyed girl looked him all over. He was the creamery shark himself, and he certainly had an oily, greasy appearance befitting his fondness for cream. However, she did not care what he was if he served her purpose. "Will you gimme a lift?" she asked. "A lift? Where?" "Anywhere out of this," and she pointed back to the smart white village up the river. "Now, what be you?" he said cunningly. "I be a runaway." "What you running from?" "I'm a running from an orphan 'sylum." "Good for you. Where are you going?" "I'm going to Australia." "Better for you. What are you going there for?" "'Cause," she said firmly, "they know how to treat orphans there. They don't shut 'em up together like a lot of sick pigs. They scatter 'em in families. The government pays their keep till they get old enough to fend for themselves. Then they gets a sum of money and they works. I heard a lady board reading it in a newspaper." "A lady board?" "Yes, lady boards has to run 'sylums." "Course they do. Well, skip in, little 'un." "There's another passenger," she said firmly, "and them as takes me takes him." "Have you got your granddaddy along?" "No, siree, but I've got something most as good as a granddaddy, and I'll thank you to keep a straight tongue when you speak of him." The young man put the offending tongue in his cheek and chuckled enjoyably as the small elfish figure disappeared in the wood. Presently she returned with a good-sized bundle in her arms that she thrust through the fence. "Give it a name," said the young man. "Why, see how it's wiggling. Must be some kind of an animal. Cat, weasel, rabbit, hen, dog. Stop there," she ejaculated. "Let it be dog. His name's Gippy." "Well, I vum," the young man said good-naturedly as she approached the sleigh and deposited her beshawled dog on his knees. "I guess this sleigh warn't built for two," she said as she crawled in beside him. "Right you are, but you don't want to be carted far. Gimme that dog," she said, taking the bundle, "and start off. Probably they're just hitching up to be after me." He clicked his tongue to the long-legged mare, and speedily fences and trees began to fly by them. "What did you twig me for?" asked the fat young man. "Ain't you had no other chance?" "Lots," she said briefly. "There was an old boy ahead of me with a two-seated rig and a youngster on the back seat. Why didn't you freeze on to him?" She turned her little dark face toward him, a little face overspread by sudden passion. "Do you know what that old shellback would 'a' done?" "He'd 'a' took you in." "He'd 'a' druv me back to that 'sylum. He looked too good, that one. You look like a baddie." "Much obliged," he said dryly. "I guess you've done bad things," she said inexorably. "You stole pies and told lies and fed dogs and cats on the sly. I guess you've been found out." The fat young man fell into a sudden reverie, and they passed several white fields in silence. "They'll never catch me," she said at last, gleefully. "We're going like the wind." The young man looked down at her. She had the appearance of a diminutive witch as she sat with one hand clasping her faded hat, the other holding firmly to the bundle on her lap. Her countenance was so much older and shrewder in some phases than in others that the young man was puzzled to guess her age. "Why, you ain't got any cloak," he said. "That's nothing but a dress you got on, ain't it? Take the shawl off that dog." "No, sir," she said decidedly. "I don't do that." "Hold on, I've got a horse blanket here," and he dived under the seat. "There," and he wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thanks," she said briefly, and again her bird-like eyes scanned the road ahead. "Hot cakes and syrup!" she exclaimed in a voice of resigned distress. "There's the North Marsden Lady Board coming. They must have phoned her. Say, mister, let me sneak under here. If she holds you up, you'll have to tell a lie." The young man grinned delightedly as the little girl slipped through the blanket and disappeared under the lap-robe. Then he again went skimming over the snow. There was a very grand sleigh approaching him, with a befurred coachman on the seat driving a pair of roan horses, and behind him a gray-haired lady smothered in handsome robes. "Please stop," she called pathetically to the approaching young man. The creamery shark pulled up his mare and blinked thoughtfully at her. "Oh, have you seen a little girl?" she said excitedly. "A poor little girl, very thin and miserable, and with a lame brown dog limping after her? She's wandering somewhere, the unfortunate misguided child. We have had such trouble with her at the Middle Marston Asylum, the orphan asylum, you know. We have fed her and clothed her, and now she's run away." The fat young man became preternaturally solemn, the more so as he heard a low growl somewhere in the region of his feet. "Did she have black hair as lanky as an Injun's?" he asked. "Yes, yes." "And a kind of sickly green dress?" "Oh, yes, and a dark complexion." "And a sort of steely air as if she dared the world?" "That's it. Oh, yes, she wasn't afraid of anyone." "Then I've sighted your game," he said, gravely, very gravely, considering that the game was pinching one of his legs. "I'll give you the scent," he went on. "Just follow this road till you come to the 3 pine trees at the cross, then turn towards Spruceville. Oh, thank you, thank you. I'm ever so much obliged. But was she on foot or driving? Driving like 60. Sitting up on the seat beside a smooth old farmer with a red wig on and a face as long as a church. A red wig? Exclaimed the lady. Why, that's Mr. Dabley. He's one of our advisory committee. Dabley or Grabley, he's driving with one of your orphans. I see her as plain as day sitting beside him. Brown face, faded black hat, sickly green frock, bundle on her lap. Farmer Dabley! Incredible! How one can be deceived! Drive on, Matthew. We must try to overtake them. Had he one horse or two? A pair, ma'am, a light-legged team, a bay and a cream. He's a regular old sport. He's a Mephistopheles if he's helping that child to escape, said the lady warmly. I'll give him a piece of my mind. Her coachman started his horses, and the little girl under the robe was beginning to breathe freely when a shout from the young man brought her heart to her mouth. Say, ma'am, was that a striped or a plain shawl she had her dog wrapped in? Striped. She had the impudence to steal it from the matron and leave a note saying she did it because her jacket was locked up and she was afraid her dog would freeze. I'm under a great obligation to you, sir. No obligation, he said, lifting his hat. I'm proud to set you on the chase after such a bad young one. That's your girl, ma'am. Her shawl was striped. I didn't tell you she had the nerve to ask me to take her in. Not really, did she? The lady called back. Then she added wonderingly, But I thought you met her driving with Farmer Dabley. They had both turned around and were talking over their shoulders. There was a terrible commotion under the lap-robe, and the young man felt that he must be brief. If you bark, I'll break your neck, he heard the refugee say in a menacing whisper, and to cover a series of protesting growls he shouted lustily, Yes, ma'am, but first I passed her on foot. Then I turned back, and she was with the farmer. That young one has got the face of a government mule, but I'm used to mules, and when she asked me, I said, "'Pears to me, little girl, you favor a runaway, and I ain't got no room for runaways in this narrow jig, specially as I'm taking a bundle of clothing to my dear old father. Likewise a young pig," he added, as there was a decided squeal from between his feet. Thank you," came faintly after him as he started off at a spanking gait, and "You're badder than I thought you was," came reproachfully from the tumbled head peeping above the lap-robe. "You're grateful," he said ironically. "I'm bad, but I only ask the Lord to forgive the lies I've got to tell," said the little girl as she once more established herself on the seat. "You should have said, 'No, ma'am, I didn't see the little girl,' and druv on." "I guess you're kind of mixed in your opinions," he remarked. "I ain't mixed in my mind. I see things as straight as that air road," she replied. "I said, 'This is a bad business, for I've got to run away, but I'll be as square as I can.'" She paused suddenly, and her companion asked, "What's up with you?" "Nothing," she said faintly. "Only I feel as if there was a rat inside of me. You ain't got any crackers round, have you?" "No, but I've got something better," and he drew a flask from the pocket of his big ulster and put it to her mouth. Her nostrils dilated. "I'm a Loyal Legion girl." "Loyal Legion? What's that?" "Beware of bottles, beware of cups, evil to him who evil sups." "Oh, a temperance crank!" And he laughed. "Well, here's a hunk of cake I put in my pocket last night." The little girl ate with avidity the section of a rich fruit loaf he handed her. "How about your dog?" asked the young man. "Oh, I guess he ain't hungry," she said, putting a morsel against the brown muzzle thrust from the shawl. "Everything was locked up last night, and there weren't enough lunch for him and me. See, he ain't for it. He knows when hunger stops and greed begins. That's poetry they taught us. Tell us about the place you've been raised. No, stop. You're kind of peaked looking. Settle down and rest yourself till we pull up for dinner. I'll gabble on a bit if you'll give me a starter." "I guess you favor birds and things, don't you?" she observed shrewdly. "Yah, do you?" "Sometimes I think I'm a bird," she said vehemently, "or a worm or something. If I could have caught one of them crows this morning, I'd have hugged it and kissed it. Ain't they lovely?" "Well, I don't know about lovely," said the young man in a judicial manner. "But the crow, as I take him, is a kind of long-suffering orphan among birds. From the minute the farmer turns up these furrows under the snow, the crow works like fury. Grubs just fly down his red throat, and grasshoppers ain't nowhere. But because he now and then lifts a hill of peteeters, and pulls a mite of corn when it gets toothsome, and makes way once in so often with a fat chicken that's a heap better out of the world than in it, the farmer is down on him. The legislature won't protect him, and the crow, man's good friend, gets shot by everybody and everything." "I wish I was a queen," said the little girl passionately. "Well, sissy, if you ever get to be one, just unmake a few laws that are passed to please the men who have a pull. Here in Maine you might take the bounty off bobcats, and let 'em have their few sheep, and you might stand between the mink and the spawning trout, and if you put a check on the robins who make war on the cherries and strawberries, I guess it would be more sensible than chasing up the crows." "I'm remarking that you don't beat your horse," said his companion abruptly. "That mare," said the young man reflectively, "is as smart as I be, and sometimes I think a thought smarter." "You wouldn't beat that little dog," she said, holding up her bundle. "Bet your striped shawl I wouldn't." "I like you," she said emphatically. "I guess you ain't as bad as you look." The young man frowned slightly and fell into another reverie. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 2. Even Sharks Have Tender Hearts. The old Moss Glen Inn, elm-shaded and half-covered by creeping vines, is a favorite resort for travelers in the eastern part of Maine, for there a good dinner can be obtained in a shorter space of time than in any other country hotel in the length and breadth of the state. "And all because there's a smart woman at the head of it," explained the young man to the little waif beside him. "There she is, always on hand." A round, good-natured face, crowning a rotund, generous figure, smiled at them from the kitchen window. But while the eyes smiled, the thick, full lips uttered a somewhat different message to a tall, thin woman bending over the stove. "Ruth Ann, here's that soapy Hank Dilson round again, taking in the farmers, as usual, engaging them to pay for machinery and buildings more than are needed, considering the number of their cows, and he's got a washed-out-looking young one with him. She'll make a breach in the victuals, I guess." Ruth Ann, who was her sister and helper in household affairs, came and looked over her shoulder, just as Dilson sprang from the sleigh. Mrs. Minley stepped to the door and stood bobbing and smiling as he turned to her. "Howdy do, Mrs. Minley. Give this little girl a place to lie down till dinner's ready, will you? She's dead beat." Tilda Jane walked gravely into the kitchen, and although her head was heavy, and her feet as light as if they were about to waft her to regions above, she took time to scrutinize the broad face that would have been generous but for the deceitful lips, and also to cast a glance at the hard, composed woman at the window, who looked as if her head, including the knob of tightly curled hair at the back, had been carved from flint. "Step right in this way," said Mrs. Minley, bustling into a small bedroom on the ground floor. Tilda Jane was not used to being waited on, and for one proud moment she wished that the children in the orphan asylum could see her. Then a feeling of danger and insecurity overcame her, and she sank on one of the painted wooden chairs. "You're done out," said Mrs. Minley sympathetically. "Are you a relation of Mr. Dilson's?" "No, I ain't." "You can lie on that bed if you like," said Mrs. Minley, noticing the longing glance cast at it. "Well, I guess I will," said Tilda Jane, placing her bundle on a chair and stooping down to unloose her shoes. "Stop till I get some newspapers to put on the bed," said the landlady. "What's in that package? It's moving." And she stared at the shawl. "It's a dog." "Mercy me! I don't allow no dogs in my house." "All right," said the little girl, patiently putting on her shoes again. "What are you going to do, child?" "I'm going to the woodshed. Them as won't have my dog won't have me." "Land sakes, child, stay where you be. I guess he can't do no harm if you'll watch him." "No, ma'am, he'll not rampage. He's little, and he's old, and he's lame, and he don't care much for walking. Sometimes you'll hear nothing out of him all day but a growl or a snap." The landlady drew away from the bundle, and after she had seen the tired head laid on the pillow, she softly closed the door of the room. In 2 minutes, Tilda Jane was asleep. The night before she had not dared to sleep. Today, under the protection of the creamery shark, she could take her rest, her hunger satisfied by the cake he had given her in the sleigh. The shark crept in once to look at her. "Ain't she a sight?" he whispered to Mrs. Minley, who accompanied him. "A half-starved monkey." She playfully made a thrust at his ribs. "Oh, go along with you. Always making your jokes. How can a child look like a monkey?" He smiled, well pleased at her cajoling tone. Then, stretching himself out in an armchair, he announced that dinner must be postponed for an hour to let the child have her sleep out. Mrs. Minley kept a pleasant face before him, but gave vent to some suppressed grumbling in the kitchen. With fortitude remarkable in a hungry man, he waited until 1 o'clock. Then, losing patience, he ate his dinner, and telling Mrs. Minley that he had business in the neighborhood and would not be back until supper time, he drove away in his sleigh. At 6 o'clock, Tilda Jane felt herself gently shaken, and opening her eyes, she started up in alarm. "All right, 'tain't the police," said Mrs. Minley. "I know all about you, little girl. You needn't be scared of me. Get up and have a bite of supper. Mr. Dilson's going away, and he wants to see you." Tilda Jane rose and put on her shoes in silence. Then she followed the landlady to the next room. For an instant she staggered back. She had never before seen such a huge open fireplace, never had had such a picture presented to her in the steam-heated orphanage. Fresh from troubled dreams, it seemed as if these logs were giants' bodies laid crosswise. The red flames were from their blood that was being licked up against the sooty stones. Then the ghastliness vanished, and she approvingly took in the picture. The fat young creamery shark standing over the white cat and rubbing her with his toe, the firelight on the wall and snowy table, and the big lamp on the mantel. "Hello!" he exclaimed, turning around. "Did you make your sleep out?" "Yes, sir," she said briefly. "Where shall I put this dog?" "Don't put him nowhere till we turn this cat out. Scat, pussy!" And with his foot he gently assisted the small animal kitchenwards. "Now you can roast your pup here," he said, pointing to the vacated corner. "Don't touch him," warned Tilda Jane, putting aside his outstretched hand. "He nips worse'n a lobster." "Fine dog, that," said the young man ironically. "Come on now, let's fall to. I guess that rat's rampaging again." "Yes, he's pretty bad," said Tilda Jane demurely, and she seated herself in the place indicated. Mrs. Minley waited on them herself, and as she passed to and fro between the dining room and kitchen, she bestowed many glances on the lean, lank little girl with the brown face. After a time, she nudged Hank with her elbow. "Look at her!" Hank withdrew his attention for a minute from his plate to cast a glance at the downcast head opposite. Then he dropped his knife and fork. "Look here! I call this kind of low down." Tilda Jane raised her moist eyes. "You've got ham and eggs, fried potatoes and toast, and 2 kinds of preserve, and hot rolls and coffee and cake and doughnuts, which is more'n you ever got at the asylum, I'll warrant, and yet you're crying, and after all the trouble you've been to me. There's no satisfying some people. Tilda Jane wiped her eyes. I ain't a-crying for the 'sylum, she said stolidly. Then what are you crying for? I'm crying 'cause it's such a long way to Australia, and I don't know no one. I wish she was a-going. I wish I was, but I ain't. Come on now, eat your supper. I suppose I'd be a fool, she muttered, picking up her knife and fork. I've often heard I was. Hi now, I guess you feel better, don't you? Said the young man, 20 minutes later. He was in excellent humor himself and, sitting tilted back in his chair by the fireplace, played a tune on his big white teeth with a toothpick. Yes, I guess I'm better, said Tilda Jane soberly. That was a good supper. How did you better feed your pup? Asked the young man. Seems to me he must be dead. He's so quiet. He's plumb beat out, I guess, said the little girl, and she carefully removed the dog's queer drapery. A little thin old brown cur staggered out, with lips viciously rolled back and a curious unsteadiness of gait. Steady, old boy, said the young man. My soul and body, he ain't got but 3 legs. Whoa, you're running into the table. He don't see very well, said Tilda Jane firmly. His eyes is poor. What's the matter with his tail? It don't seem to be hung on right. It wobbles from having tin cans tied to it. Gippy dear, here's a bone. Gippy dear, muttered the young man. I'd shoot him if he was my dog. If that dog died, I'd die, said the little girl passionately. We've got to keep him alive, then, said the young man good-humoredly. Can't you give him some milk? She poured out a saucerful and set it before him. The partially blind dog snapped at the saucer, snapped at her fingers until he smelled them and discovered whose they were. Then he finally condescended to lick out the saucer. And you like that thing? Said the young man curiously. Like him? I love him, said Tilda Jane, affectionately stroking the brown, ugly back. And when did he give away that leg? She shook her head. It's long to tell. I guess you'd ask me to shut up before I got through. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Sam from www.thisvoiceofmine.com.
Chapter 3 of Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 3. The Story of Her Life. The young man said nothing more at the time, but 10 minutes later, when he was thoughtfully smoking a long brown pipe, and Tilda Jane sat in a chair beside him, rocking her dog, he called out to Mrs. Medley, who was hovering around the room. Sit down, Mrs. Medley. Perhaps you can get this little girl to talk. I can't. Tilda Jane turned sharply to him. Oh, mister, I'll do anything for you. I'll talk. Well, reel it off then. I got to start soon. What do you want to know? She said doggedly. Everything. Tell me where you started from. Was you born in the asylum? Nobody don't know where I was born. Nobody don't know who I am, 'cept that a woman come to the poorhouse with me to Middle Marsden when I was a baby. She died and I was left. They give me the name of Tilda Jane Harper and put me in the asylum. Children come and went. Just as soon as I get to like 'em, they'd be adopted. I never was adopted, 'cause I'm so ugly. My eyes ought to have been blue, and my hair curly. I might have been a servant, but my habits was in the way. Habits? What habits? Asked Hank. Habits of impudence and pig-headedness. When the men came to kill the pigs, I'd shut myself in my room, put my fingers in my ears, and I couldn't hear, but I'd always squeal when the pigs squealed. Is that why you wouldn't eat ham just now? Oh, that ain't ham to me, she said eloquently. That bit of red meat was a cunning, teeny, white pig running around a pen crying 'cause the butcher's after him. I couldn't eat it any more'n I'd eat my brother. You're a queer little kite, interjected the young man. He exchanged an amused glance with Mrs. Minley, who was swaying gently back and forth in a rocking chair. So you wasn't very much set up at the asylum, he went on. I guess I'm too bad for asylum. Once our washerwoman took me home to supper. I guess heaven must be like that. They had a cat, too. I used to get in most trouble at the 'sylum 'bout cats. When starvin' ones come rubbin' up agin me in the garden, I couldn't help sneakin' 'em a bit of bread from the pantry. It beats all how cats find out people as likes 'em. Then I'd get jerked up. Jerked up? Repeated her interlocutor. Locked in my room or have my hand slapped. Once I took a snake in the house. He was cold, but he got away from me, and the matron found him in her bed. She whipped me at that time. Was that what made you run away? No, I run away on account of this dog. You call up the cold spell we had a week ago? You bet. I was out in it. Well, there come the coldest night. The matron gives us extra blankets, but I couldn't sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night and thought of that dog out in the stable. He'll freeze, I said, and when I said it, it seemed as if icicles was sticking into me. I was most crazy. I got up and looked out the window. There was a moon, an awful biting, ugly kind of moon, grinning at me. I put on some clothes. I slipped downstairs, and it seemed as if everything was yelling in the cold. Every board and every wall I touched went off like a gun, but no one woke, and I got out in the stable. The horse was warm, and so was the cow, but this little dog was most froze. I tried to warm him, but my fingers got like sticks. Then I did a scandalous thing. I says, I'll take him in bed with me and warm him for a spell, and no one will know. So I lugged him in the house, and he cuddled down on my arm just so cunning. Then I tried to stay awake so I could carry him out early in the morning. But didn't I fall to sleep, and the first thing I knowed there was the matron a-spearing me with her eyes, and she put out her hand to catch the dog, and he up and bit her, and then there was trouble. What kind of trouble? Asked the young man. I had bread and water for 2 days, and the dog was shut up in the stable, and then I was brought up before the lady board. The lady board? Murmured Mrs. Minley. What does the child mean? The board of lady managers, explained Dilson. Tell us about it, he said to 'Tilda Jane. The latter was keeping an eye on the clock. She knew that the time must come soon for her to part from her new-found friend. It was not in her nature to be very demonstrative, yet she could not altogether hide a certain feverishness and anxiety. One thing, however, she could do, and she subdued her emotion in order to do it. It amused the young man to hear her talk. She would suppress her natural inclination to silence and gravity, and try to entertain him, and the more she talked, possibly, the longer he would stay. Therefore she went on. There they sat round the table, as big and handsome as so many pies. One lady was at the top, and she rapped on the table with a little hammer and said, "'Tention, ladies." Then she says, Here is the fortunate object of dissection. What part shall we tackle first? Name your wishes, ladies. Then she stopped, another lady begun. Ma'am, presiding, state the case. The young man took his pipe from his mouth, and Mrs. Minley ejaculated, "Mercy me!" "Madam President, I guess," he said gravely. "Go on, sissy." Tilda Jane went on, still with her eye on the clock and still speaking feverishly. "The ma'am presiding staked me out," says she. "Here's a little girl. She come to us like a lily of the field. No dress on, no bonnet, no nothin'. We fed and clothed the lily, and guv her good advice, and she's lifted up her heel agin us. She deifies us. She introduces toads and snakes into the sacred pressings of our sinning for orphans. She packs a dirty dog in bed. We'll never levelate her. She's lowering the key of our 'stution. She knows not the place of reptiles and quadruples. Ladies, shall we keep this little disturbing element in our 'stution? If they hand fend against thee, cut it off. If thy foot straggle, treat it likewise." Then she sat down, and another lady got up. Says she, "I'm always for mercy, strained mercy dropping like juice from heaven. If this little girl is turned inside out, she'll be a bright and shining star. I propose that we make the 'speriment. The tastes is in her, but we can nip off the gratifications. I remove that instead of disturbing her, we disturb the animals. Ladies, we has hard work to run this 'stution." "This 'stution," said the young man. "Yes, 'stution," repeated 'Tilda Jane. "That's what they call the asylum. Well, this lady went on and says she, 'Let's send away the cats and dogs and all the children's pets, squirrels and pigeons and rabbits, 'cause this little girl is disrupting every child on the place. Once when cats came and other animals, they was stoned away. Now they're took in. I come across one little feller just now, and instead of learning his lesson, he was playin' with a beetle, ticklin' it with a straw, ladies. Now ain't that awful? We've got 'sponsibilities toward these foundlings. I feels like a mother. If we send some foolish out in the world, we'll be blamed. Our faithful matron says it's impossible to catch rats and mice. This little girl gets at the traps and lets 'em go. She's a born rule smasher." Then she closed her mouth and sat down, and the big lady sitting at the head of the table pounded her hammer, 'cause they all fell to jabbering. Says she, "Will some lady make a commotion?" Then one lady got up, and she says, "I remove that all animals be discharged from this 'stution." "What about the chickings?" called out another lady. "You must declude them. This will go on record." The other lady said, "'Scuse me, I forgot the chickens. I'll mend my disillusion. I remove that all quadruples be discharged from this 'stution." That suited some and didn't suit t'others, and there was a kind of chatter valley. One lady said she's mend the amendment, and then the man presiding got kind of mixy-maxy and said they better start all over again, 'cause she'd lose her way 'mong so many amendments. After a long time they got their ideas sot, and they said that I was to stay, but the animals was to go. I didn't snuffle nor nothin', but I just said, "Are you plannin' to kill that there dog?" The man presiding gave a squeal and said, "No, that would be cruel. they would give the dog to some little feller who would be good to him. I said little fellers tie tin cans to dogs' tails, and they got mad with me and said I was trespicious. Then I said all right, 'cause what could I do agin a whole lot of lady boards? But I made up my mind I'd have to work my way out of it, 'cause it would kill that little dog to be took from me. So I run away." Her story was done, and her lips in dogged resolution. She stared inquiringly at the young man. He was not going to withdraw his protection from her, she saw that. But what would he direct her to do next? He was thoughtfully tapping his pipe against the fireplace. Now he was putting it in his pocket, and now he was going to speak. "Little girl, you've started for Australia. And as I don't believe in checking a rarin', tearin' ambition, I won't try to block you exactly, but only to sidetrack. You can't go to Australia bang off. It's too far, and you haven't got the funds. Now I'll make a proposition. I've got an old father, most as cranky as that there dog. I guess if you're so long-sufferin' with the animal, you'll be long-sufferin' with the human. He needs some tidy body to keep his house trigged up and to wait on him, 'cause he's lame. He has an everlasting wrastle to keep a housekeeper on account of this same flashlight temper. But I guess, from what I've seen of you, that you could fix him, and you'd have a home which you seem to hanker for, and you could have some money and start for Australia when you put enough flesh on those bones to keep you from blowing away into the sea and getting lost. Starting out would be convenient, for my father lives near the big Canadian railway that is a round-the-world route. You can step aboard the cars, go to the Pacific, board a steamer, and go on your way to Australia. What do you say? Is it a bargain?" Tilda Jane sat like a statue. The firelight danced behind her little grave profile that remained unchanged, save for the big tears rolling slowly and deliberately down each thin cheek and dropping on the faded dress. Only the tears and the frantically clasped hands betrayed emotion. "I guess it's a go," said the young man kindly. "Here's my father's address." And getting up, he handed a card to her. "Hobart Dilson, Ciscasset, Maine. I've got to make tracks now. But Mrs. Minley here will put you on the train that comes by here in the morning, and all you have to do is sit still in it till you hear the conductor holler, 'Ciscasset.' Then you hustle out and ask someone where Hobart Dilson lives. When you get there, don't shake if he throws a crutch at you. Just tell him you've come to stay and I'm going to pay extra for it. That'll cool him, 'cause he had to pay a housekeeper out of his own allowance up to this. The old boy and I don't rub along together very sweet, but he knows the size of a dollar every time." Tilda Jane choked back the suffocating lump in her throat and gravely rose to her feet. "Sir, I'm as much obleeged to you as—" Here she broke down. "As you ought to be. Don't mention it. I'm happy to make your acquaintance. So long." And he politely held out 2 fingers. A vague terror seized the little girl. He had arranged everything for her, and yet she had never since her escape felt so paralyzed with fear. Her beseeching eyes sought Mrs. Minley's face. The landlady was smiling graciously at her, but the little girl's heart sunk. Quite unknown to herself, she was a sharp reader of character. She was losing her best friend in the fat young man. "Take me with you," she gasped, suddenly clinging to his hand. "Can't do that, sissy. I'm going back into the settlements. Bad roads, scattered houses. You'd freeze stiff. Better stay here with Mrs. Minley. I'll run up to Ciscasset by and by to see you." 'Tilda Jane drew back in sudden, steely composure. She was ashamed of herself. "I'm crazy," she said shortly. "You've done enough for me now. I'll take care of your father if he gets mad 50 times a day." Already she felt a sense of responsibility. She drew herself up with dignity and in sad, composed silence watched the young man leave the room and the house. When the last faint sound of his sleigh bells had died away, she gave up her listening attitude and turned patiently to Mrs. Minley, who was saying with a yawn, "I guess you'd better go to bed." 'Tilda Jane walked obediently toward her room, and Mrs. Minley, seating herself on a chair in cold curiosity, watched her undress. When the little girl knelt down to say her prayers, a feeble smile illuminated the woman's face. However, she was still listless and uninterested until the latter portion of the petition. "O Lord," 'Tilda Jane was praying earnestly, almost passionately, "forgive me for all this sin and iniquity. I just had to run away. I couldn't give up that little dog that thou didst send me. I'll live square as soon as I get taken care o' that old man. Bless the matron and make her forgive me, and bless all the lady boards, Miss Grannis specially, 'cause she'll be maddest with me. Keep me from telling any more lies. Amen." When 'Tilda Jane rose from her knees, Mrs. Minley's breath was coming and going quickly, and there was a curious light in her eyes. "Mrs. Grannis, did you say?" she asked shortly. "Mrs. Grannis over Beaver Dam way?" "Yes, ma'am." "What has she got to do with the asylum?" "She's the fust lady board. She sits behind the table and pounds the hammer." "And she'll be maddest with you?" "Yes, ma'am. She says children has too much liberties." "Hurry into bed," said Mrs. Minley briefly, and taking up the lamp and without a word of farewell, she disappeared from the room. 'Tilda Jane cowered down between the cold sheets. Then she stretched out a hand to touch the precious bundle on the chair by her bed, and then she tried to go to sleep, but sleep would not come. End of Chapter 3 of 'Tilda Jane. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 4 of 'Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Audrey Giger. 'Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 4. Unstable as Water. A vague uneasiness possessed her. Ah, how happy would she be, could she know that the young creamery man was sleeping under the same roof. But he was speeding somewhere far away over the snowy roads. However, she should see him again. He had said so, and, with the hopefulness of youth, she sighed a happy sigh, and, closing her eyes tightly, listened to the various sounds about the quiet house. There must have been another arrival, for she heard doors opening and shutting, and also the jingle of sleigh bells. They were strangely confused in her mind with the ringing of the rising bell at the orphan asylum, and she was just sinking into a dreamy condition, a forerunner of sleep, when she heard a hard voice in her ear. "Get up and dress, little girl." She raised herself quietly from the pillow. There stood over her the tall, gaunt woman whom she had heard Mrs. Minley address as Ruth Ann. To her perturbed mind there rose a vision of a graven image from the Bible, as she stared at the woman's stony countenance. She was standing shading a candle with her hand, and her deep eyes were fixed in unmistakable compassion on the little girl. "Jump up," she repeated, "and dress like 60. You've got yourself into a peck of trouble." 'Tilda Jane had not thought of questioning the wisdom of this command. Something about the hard-faced woman inspired her with confidence, and without a word she stepped out of bed and began rapidly putting on her clothes. "I'll talk while you dress," said the woman in a hard, intense voice, and putting down the candle. "But, Lord, how can I say it all?" There was a kind of desperation in her tone, although no trace of emotion appeared on her face. 'Tilda Jane felt a strange kinship with this reserved woman, and flashed her a sympathetic glance while buttoning one of her stout and ugly garments. Ruth Ann made a brief grimace. "Here I am," she said, with a sudden burst of speech, "a middle-aged woman getting old. You're a young one setting out on life's journey. I'll never see you again, probably. Let me give you a word. Be honest, and, if you can't be honest, be as honest as you can. You'll have no luck otherwise. You may think you're havin' luck in bein' sly, but it's a kind o' luck that turns to loss in the long run. There's that sister o' mine. She reminds me o' Reuben in the Bible. Unstable as water thou shalt not excel. She's that deceitful that I should think she'd choke with it so she couldn't breathe." 'Tilda Jane made no remark, but as she threw her dress over her head, her two black eyes scintillated wonderingly in the woman's direction. "Unstable," said Ruth Ann bitterly. "I'd 'a' loved her if she'd been honest, but it's always the same, fair to the face, foul behind the back. I've slaved for her and waited on her, and heard her praised for work I've done, and seen young men ogle her, and she ogle back, and I've never had an offer, and never will, and sometimes I think I hate her." 'Tilda Jane paused for an instant in her rapid dressing. This sisterly repulsion was something unknown to her childish experience. "Then when she gets sick o' stuffin' herself, I'm feared, and think she's going to die, but she'll 'tend my funeral, and cry and look so handsome that some old Jack will pop the question on the way home. Here, child, eat these while you dress." And she drew some doughnuts from her pocket. 'Tilda Jane pushed them from her, with an involuntary movement of dislike. "You've turned agin me for turning agin my sister," said the woman bitterly. "Wait till you're treated as I am. And let me tell you what she's done to you. You made mention o' Miss Grannis. Miss Grannis has got a mortgage on this house. Miss Grannis lends her money. Miss Grannis is the god my sister bows down to. Do you think she'd let you stand between her and Miss Grannis? No, the minute she heard you say Miss Grannis would be pleased to get you back, that minute she made up her mind to fool you and Hank Dillson, that she can't abide 'cause he ain't never asked her to stop bein' a widow. So she made me help her hitch up, and she's off on the wings of the wind to tell her sweet Miss Grannis to come and get you, and just to fool her who is so cute at foolin' other folks. I made up my mind to get you off. Now do you take it in?" 'Tilda Jane did take in this alarming bit of news, and for one instant stood aghast. Then she resolutely fell to lacing her shoes. "You're gritty," said the woman admiringly. "Now I'll tell you what I've laid out. I'm going to guide you through the woods to the Moss Glen station. When we get most thar, I'll skedaddle home and to bed, 'cause I don't want sister to find me out. Here's an extry pair of stockings and shoes to put on before you board the train. You'll get yours full of snow water. If all goes as I calculate, you'll have time to change 'em in the station. You don't want to get sick so you can't stand up to that old man. Here's a little tippet for your shoulders. Dillson told sister to give you a shawl, but she'll not do it, and he paid her, too. Now come, let's start." 'Tilda Jane brushed her hand over her eyes, resolutely picked up her dog, and followed her guide out to the kitchen. Ruth Ann caught up a shawl, threw it over her head, and opened the door. "My, it's black. I guess we'll have to take a lantern." She turned back, fumbled in a corner of the kitchen, struck a light, then rejoined 'Tilda Jane. For some minutes they plodded on in silence. Then Ruth Ann said, anxiously, "I don't know what I'll do if it don't snow. She'll track us, sure. Me, big feet, and you, smaller ones. Glory, it's snowing now." A sudden wind had sprung up in the black, quiet night, and whirled a few flakes of snow in their faces. Then the snow began to fall from above, gently and quietly, flake by flake. 'Tilda Jane struggled along the heavy road in the wake of the tall woman ahead. The small dog seemed to have grown larger, and lay a heavy burden in her arms. Yet she uttered no word of complaint. Her mind was in a whirl, and she gave no thought to physical fatigue. What was she doing? Had she, a little girl, any right to give so much trouble to grown people? Her actions were exactly in opposition to every precept that had been instilled into her mind. Children should be seen and not heard. Children should wait on grown people. Children must not lie under any circumstances. They must be obedient, truthful, honest, and uncomplaining. Perhaps she ought to go back to the orphan asylum. She could stand punishment herself. But her dog? They would make her give him up. Some boy would get him. Boys were all mischievous at times. Could she endure the thought of that little feeble frame subjected to torture? She could not, and steeling her heart against the asylum, the matron, and the lady managers, she walked on more quickly than ever. She would never forget that ghostly walk through the woods. The narrow way wound always between high, snow-laden sentinels of trees. The sickly, slanting gleam of the lantern lighted only a few steps ahead. Mystery and solemnity were all about her. The pure and exquisite snow, on which they were putting their black-shod feet, was to her the trailing robe of an angel who had gone before. The large, flat snowflakes showered on her erring head were missives from the skies. "Go back, little girl, go back." "Lord, I can't go back," she repeated stubbornly, "but I'll repent some more, by and by. Please take away the sick feeling in the middle of my stomach. I can't enjoy anything." The sick feeling continued, and she gave Ruth Ann only a feeble "yes," when she suddenly turned and threw the light of the lantern on her with a brisk, "Don't you want to know what lie I'm going to tell about your leavin'?" "I'm not going to tell any lie," Ruth Ann continued triumphantly. "If you've got grace enough to hold your tongue, other folks'll do all your lying for you. Sister'll come home, Miss Grannis with her, probably. They'll go ravagin' in the spare room. They'll come ravagin' out. Ruth Ann, that young one's run off, and I'll be busy with my pots and pans, and all I'll have to say is, 'Do tell,' or 'Why, how you talk,' and sister'll rave and tear and run round like a crazy thing, and look at Miss Grannis out of the corner of her eye." Ruth Ann's shoulders shook with enjoyable laughter, but if she had turned suddenly she would have seen a look of unmistakable disgust flitting over the face behind her. She did turn suddenly a few minutes later, but the look was gone. "Here, give me that dog," she said peremptorily. The little girl protested, but the woman took him, and again they plodded on in silence. "Here we be," she said after they had been walking for an hour longer. 'Tilda Jane raised her head. The narrow road had abruptly expanded into a circular clearing, and in the midst of the clearing stood a small wooden building. Ruth Ann walked up to it, handed 'Tilda Jane the dog and the lantern, and put her hands on one of the diminutive windows. It opened easily, and she ejaculated with satisfaction, "Just what I thought. Come, crawl in here. The station agent's been here all the evenin', and the fire ain't quite out. You'll be as snug as a bug in a rug. He'll be back at daylight again, and soon after your train'll come along for Ciscasset. Don't you breathe a word to him 'bout me. Say Miss Minley brought you here, if he asks anything. Here's enough money to buy your ticket. I ain't got much. Sister keeps me short, and she took away with her what Hank Nelson gave her for you. Mind and keep that card with his father's name pinned inside your dress. Here's a lunch," and she produced a parcel from her pocket. "Don't fret, sister can't get home much before breakfast, and by that time you'll be in Ciscasset, and I guess they'll not follow you there. She don't know the name of the place, anyway. She didn't take no count when Hank mentioned it, and when she asked me, you'd better believe I forgot it, too." 'Tilda Jane scrambled through the window, and, upon arriving inside, turned around and gravely shook hands with her guide. "I guess I shan't forget this." "Don't you take no pains to remember it before sister," said the woman, with a chuckle. "If you don't want me to live and die in hot water. Good luck to you. Shut the winder and put a stick on the fire," and she strode off through the snow. 'Tilda Jane shuddered. She was not a nervous child, yet the knowledge that she was alone in a forest pressed and bore down upon her. However, she was out of the increasing storm. She had got her guilty feet off that angel's trailing robe, and the little letters from heaven were not dashing in her face. Nor was there any danger now that one of the groaning trees bending to lament over her would fall and crush her shrinking form. They were creaking all around the circular opening, those spying trees staring through the curtainless windows at her, and instead of throwing on more wood and making a blaze that would enable her to be plainly seen, she opened the stove door and, cowering over the embers, changed her wet footgear and tried to dry her clinging skirts. She was entirely miserable until the frightened dog crept into her arms. Here was something weaker and more in need of protection than herself, and, hugging him closely to her, she prepared to spend the rest of the night in a patient waiting for the morning. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Audrey Giger. Chapter 5 of Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Audrey Giger. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 5. Another Adventure. The quietest and most undemonstrative passenger on the night train from Boston was the shabby little girl in the corner with the bundle beside her on the seat. The conductor, after one sharp glance, paid no attention to her. The brakeman paid no attention to her. The boy with the gumdrops and the novels ignored her. She had the air of knowing where she was going, and also of being utterly uninteresting, and greatly to her relief she was left entirely to her own devices. In reality, Tilda Jane was in a state of semi-paralysis. She scarcely dared to move, to breathe. All her life had been spent in the quiet precincts of the asylum. She had scarcely been allowed to go to the small village in its vicinity, and when she had been allowed to visit it, she had seen nothing as wonderful as this, for there was no railway there. It took her breath away to be whirled along at so rapid a rate. She wondered how the people dared to walk about. She wondered how she had ever had the courage enough to step on board the flaming, roaring monster that had come rushing out of the woods as if it would devour the little station, the agent, herself, and her dog. But they had not been devoured, and the agent had guided her staggering footsteps toward the monster. If he had not done so, she would in her bewilderment have been left a prey for the pitiless Mrs. Minley. For 2 hours she sat with swimming brain. Then it occurred to her that she must in some way acquaint this wonderful and frightful means of locomotion with her desire to alight at her destination. She closely watched the people entering and leaving the car, and discovered that immediately following the entrance of a man who bawled some unintelligible exclamation, something took place that reminded her of a game played at the asylum. Certain people went out, and certain others came in and took their places. She must catch this noisy man and speak to him. She patiently waited for him to pass through the car, whence he swept by her, and then some time elapsed before she saw him again. The train had been waiting for 15 minutes at a station. A number of men had gone out and presently come back brushing their mustaches and with toothpicks between their teeth. This must be an eating place, and Ruth Ann said that Tilda Jane would arrive in Ciscasset before breakfast time. The little girl desperately addressed a passenger passing her. "I say, sir, when do we come to Ciscasset?" "Ciscasset!" repeated the man. "We passed it an hour ago." "Passed it!" she echoed stupidly. The man turned to a newsagent sauntering by. "Here, you, send the conductor here." The conductor did not appear, but a brakeman came. "Got carried beyond your station, little girl. You're in Canada now, but it's all right. We'll ship you off at the next stop. Number 8 will take you back. All right." 'Tilda Jane fell back on her seat with a strange sinking of heart. She remembered now that Hank Delson had said the conductor would holler Ciscasset, but, if he had done so, she had not distinguished the words in the strange sounds issuing from his mouth. It seemed as if only a few bewildered minutes had passed when someone ejaculated, "Macadam Junction!" and the friendly brakeman was beside her. She felt herself lifted from her seat, bundle and all, and swung to a platform, where she stood among a group of people. She did not know where to go or what to do, and remained as one in a dream until someone touched her shoulder. "You the little girl carried beyond her station?" "Yes, sir," she gasped, and looked up into the pleasant face of a young man bending over her. "All right. The conductor told me about you. Come in here." And he led the way to a waiting room. "Had your breakfast?" "No, sir, but I've got it here," and she pulled Ruth Ann's parcel out of her pocket. The young man smiled and motioned it back. "Come have some hot coffee," and he passed through a doorway into an eating room, where 'Tilda Jane presently found herself seated before a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of beefsteak and potatoes. "I ain't got any money to pay for this," she said bluntly to the young woman who set the tempting viands before her. "That's all right," said the girl, smiling. 'Tilda Jane picked up her knife and fork. "All right" seemed to be a railway expression. It was immensely comforting to her, and she soberly partook of the hot breakfast, drank all her coffee, and emptied the scraps from her plate into her handkerchief. Then she approached the counter where the young woman stood. "Thank you kindly, ma'am. I've made a good meal." Then she went outdoors into the crisp morning air. The snowstorm was over, and the day was delightful, blue above, white below. It was like a fairy world. She walked to the end of the platform, unrolled her shawl, and, freeing her mummy-like dog, set his breakfast before him. He ate with avidity, then, showing a disinclination to return to his bandages, hopped on his 3 legs along the platform beside her, his crooked tail meanwhile describing successive circles in the air. Some of the loiterers about the station gathered around him, and, seeing that his bodily infirmities were a subject of mirth rather than of compassion, Tilda Jane, in spite of warm protests on his part, once more swathed him in his shawl and carried him with dignity into the waiting room. There she sat until the agreeable young man ran in and said her train was coming. Something warned her that she ought to implore him to tell someone to take care of her, to see that she did not again get carried beyond her destination, but a kind of paralysis seized upon her tongue, and she could only open her mouth and gaze stupidly at him. "You'll be all right now," he said with a nod. "Jump when you hear Ciscasset." Ciscasset, Ciscasset. She repeated the name in a kind of desperation. Then, as the train started with a jerk and she tumbled into a seat, she said aloud, without addressing anyone in particular, "I wish to jump off at Ciscasset." "Bless the child!" ejaculated an old lady in the seat before her. "I guess this is her first journey," and turning around, she stared mildly. "Oh, ma'am," said 'Tilda Jane, "can't you help me get off at Ciscasset? The train goes so fast, and I'm so little." "Bless the child!" said the old lady again. "Of course I will. Conductor, this little girl wishes to get off at Ciscasset." "All right," said that official, hurrying by. "This little girl wishes to get off at Ciscasset," exclaimed the old lady once more, this time to a brakeman. He nodded and passed on, and presently the conductor returned and said smartly, "Tickets." "I ain't got any," replied 'Tilda Jane. "Then you must buy one," said the old lady. "Have you got any money, my dear?" 'Tilda Jane had never thought of asking the conductor if he had not been informed of her mishap. She never dreamed that the pleasant-faced young man had forgotten to ask that she be carried back to the station for which she had bought her ticket. Therefore she drew her handkerchief from her pocket, untied a knot in its corner, and slowly produced 50 cents. "Is that all the money you've got?" asked the conductor briskly. "Yes, sir." "Where do you come from?" 'Tilda Jane preserved a discreet silence. "Put it up," he said, waving his hand toward the handkerchief, and immediately going away. "Oh, what a nice, kind man," said the old lady. "He's going to let you ride free." 'Tilda Jane breathed more freely, and returned her handkerchief to its place. The conductor, meanwhile, had gone to a Pullman car in the rear, where a man in plain clothes was lying back on a seat, apparently engaged in an aimless, leisurely scrutiny of the occupants of the car. "Jack," said the conductor, "there's a slip of a girl in the day car. Poor clothes, shawl bundle, no money, won't tell me where she comes from, making a great fuss about going to Ciscasset. Looks like an immigrant." "All right," said Jack laconically. Then he gave an imperceptible nod toward the trio of well-dressed young men engaged in card playing. "Want to see me nab that New York jeweler's clerk?" "Yup," said the conductor. "Got any telegrams in your pocket?" "2. Lend me one, and sit down here a minute." Jack got up, the conductor took the vacated seat, and waited 1, 2, 3 minutes, and then Jack reappeared from between the curtains of the drawing room at the rear of the car. "A telegram for H.G. Bolingbroke," he called in a loud voice. "Any passenger of that name in this car." The youngest of the 3 men playing cards involuntarily raised his head, started from his seat, half extended his hand, then drew back. Jack tossed the telegram to the conductor, and nodded to the young man. "Thought you were traveling under an assumed name, H.J. Bolingbroke, alias Brixton. Have you got those diamonds in your pocket?" The young man flushed painfully, while his fellow players threw down their cards and surveyed him curiously. "Trouble you to follow me to another car," said Jack, and he led the way for the detected smuggler. 'Tilda Jane saw the 2 men pass, and innocently stared at them, little dreaming that her turn was to come next. After a while, Jack reappeared and sat in a seat behind 'Tilda Jane, After noticing the ineffectual attempts made by the old lady to draw the little girl into conversation, he leaned over and poured some candy into her lap from a bag he held in his hand. "Have some, sissy?" She gratefully flashed him a glance over her shoulder. "Thank you, sir." "Going far?" he asked agreeably. "To Ciscasset," she said feverishly. "Will you tell me when we come to it?" "Certainly. Going to visit friends?" "No, sir." "Oh, going home?" "No, sir." "Your home isn't quite so near as Ciscasset?" "No, sir." "Did you bring that small dog across the ocean with you?" he asked, his keen eye noticing a stirring inside the bundle. "No, sir." "Where did you pick him up?" "Some boys were going to drown him." "So you're a kind little girl." "I ain't so good as I ought to be," she said warmly, "but I'm going to try to be better. Oh, sir, are we at Ciscasset yet?" "No, this is Vanceboro, a border station between Canada and the States. I guess you'd better come this way for Ciscasset, little girl." "Why, this train goes directly to Ciscasset," interposed the old lady. "Yes, ma'am, but this little girl is a stopover. She'll probably go on the next train." The old lady grew suspicious. "You let that child alone, sir. Where's the conductor? Conductor, I say, come here. Can't some one get the conductor? Don't go with him one step, little girl." 'Tilda Jane, grown very pale, gazed apprehensively at the man and did not offer to leave her seat. He threw back his coat and displayed a badge. "Madam, I'm a government inspector." "A government inspector? What's that?" the old lady spluttered, eyeing him over her glasses. "Well, madam, there ain't much time for explanation, but I can tell you this much, namely, that we have to detain and examine all persons without means of livelihood who attempt to enter the United States from foreign countries." She still gazed at him suspiciously. "I never heard of such a thing. I guess this is a free country." "Yes, ma'am, and the government wants to keep it free. If you get a lot of pauper foreigners here, it'll not be free long." "This little girl is American, ain't you, sissy?" "I'm an orphan," said 'Tilda Jane guardedly. Whatever happened, she was determined not to admit too much. At this moment the conductor appeared, and the old lady hailed him indignantly. "What does this mean, sir? This little girl offered to pay her passage. I saw her with my own eyes. Now you're going to put her off the train." "It's all right, ma'am," he said soothingly. "She'll likely be allowed to go on tomorrow." "And you'll keep that innocent child here all day, and she too frightened to breathe," cried the old lady. "I never heard of such doings. I'll write the president. I'll show you up in the papers." "She'll be well taken care of, madam," said the conductor. "There's a good hotel here. All detained are lodged and fed at government expense. She'll be put in charge of a chambermaid." "You're a set of villains," said the old lady wrathfully. "Oh, law!" groaned the conductor. "I'm sick of these fusses. Pick up her traps, Jack." "Come, little girl," said Jack kindly, and 'Tilda Jane, seeing that the inevitable had once more overtaken her, rose resignedly, but the too kind and officious old lady clung to her so wildly that the two men were forced to draw her away from her. 'Tilda Jane, in a state of complete bewilderment totally unmixed with terror, for she had taken a liking to the kind face of her guide, trotted meekly after him into the shadow of a long V-shaped building. The platform was crowded with people. 2 trains were standing at the station, and in a large dining room on her right she saw thronged tables and hurrying waitresses. She was ushered into a room where there was a handsomely dressed woman with a flushed face and tearful eyes, a dejected-looking boy and girl sitting very close to each other, a diminutive and poorly dressed German Jew, and a composed-looking man sitting behind a small table. "I'll leave you here now," said her guide. "Don't be scared, but speak up," and with a reassuring smile he disappeared. End of chapter 5. Recording by Audrey Giger.
Chapter 6 of Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 6. 'Tilda Jane sat down on a bench in the corner and took the dog on her lap. The fashionably dressed woman was speaking. and gesticulating earnestly in front of the man whose face was only a trifle less calm and stony than that of Ruth Ann. I never heard of such a thing in my life. To take my sealskin coat from me in the dead of winter. Now, if it was summer, it wouldn't be so bad. My nice coat that cost me $475. The man listened stolidly. And you tell me your government orders you to take ladies' jackets from them? It seems incredible. Tilda Jane curiously scanned the garment under discussion. It certainly was very handsome. It is incredible, madam. The government does not wish to deprive ladies of their sealskin coats. It merely requires its custom officials, of whom I am one, to enforce the law, which has been made to prevent the importation of sealskin coats free of duty. Have you taken many jackets? Sneered the woman. The official gazed at her in frigid silence. I'll go back to Toronto, where I live, she said indignantly. I was going to buy my daughter's trousseau in New York, but I'll spend every cent at home. That's the way we will make New York suffer on account of your government being so hateful. And she flounced from the room. The man behind the table cast a leisurely glance over the remaining occupants of the room. Then he addressed the dejected boy and girl. "Hello, you. What's your name?" "Thaddeus and Mary Lee," said the boy mournfully. "Brother and sister?" "Man and wife," responded the boy lugubriously. The assistant inspector elevated his eyebrows. "What ages?" 19 and 17, sighed the lad. "Where are you going?" "To Boston." "What for?" "To look for work." "Got any money?" $2.70. "That all?" "Yes, sir." "What place do you come from?" "Chickamauga, Quebec." "You'll take the 8:15 a.m. train back tomorrow," said the man briefly. "Now, Deutscher," and he nodded to the German Jew. The boy and girl left the room hand in hand, with melancholy clothing like a garment, and 'Tilda Jane gazed after them with wide open eyes. Her attention was soon distracted, for the little Jew, the instant he was indicated, sprang from his seat, extended both hands, and nimbly skipping over the floor between his numerous bundles, overwhelmed the inspector with a flood of German. The inspector leaned back in his chair, and at last put up a hand with a commanding "Halt!" The old man paused, open-mouthed, and the inspector went on in German. "You left your home, you crossed the sea, you wish to go to Portland, to relatives. So far, so good. But where are your papers?" The old man broke into a second burst of eloquence. "Your certificate," reiterated the inspector. "Your writing from the captain of the ship." The old man shook his head sadly. He had no papers. 'Tilda Jane did not understand a word of what he was saying, but his gestures were expressive, and she anxiously watched his interlocutor. "Where did you land?" asked the inspector. "In Halifax, Nova Scotia." "From what ship?" "Das Wilken." "Captain's name?" "Strasburger." "Your name?" "Franz Weir." "I'll telegraph him, that's all." "And can I not go to my friends now at once? They are waiting. They are expecting. We have so much to say." "No," said the inspector, and as the German burst into groans and lamentations, he waved him from the room. When the door closed and 'Tilda Jane felt that the cold and scrutinizing eyes of the inspector were fixed on her, she was stricken with sudden dumbness. How these people had talked! She could not, in a month, utter as much as they had said in a few minutes. The result of their loquacity had been a seeming paralysis of her organs of speech. "What's your name, little girl?" said the official, with slight geniality. Her lips parted, but no sound came from them. "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" he asked agreeably. She shook her head, not from any knowledge of his meaning, but to signify her disinclination for speech. "Parlez-vous français?" he went on patiently. Her head again negatived this question, and he inquired in Spanish if she knew that tongue. The shaking of the head became mechanical, and as the inspector knew 17 languages, he addressed her successively in each one of them. After she had shaken her head at them all, he surveyed her a few seconds in meditative silence. Then he began to talk on his fingers. She was probably deaf and dumb. 'Tilda Jane joyfully uncurled her hands from the bundle on her lap. This was a safe medium of conversation, for talking on the fingers had been a favourite amusement of the orphans during silence hours, and she would not be tempted to say too much and betray the fact that she was a runaway. Accordingly, she spelled out the information. "I am an orphan." "Where do you come from?" he asked her. "A long ways off," her fingertips informed him. "Name of place?" "I can't tell you," she responded. "Where are you going?" he inquired. "To—" She hesitated about the spelling of Ciscasset, but got something near enough to it for him to understand. "Any relatives there?" he spelled on his fingers. "No." "Going to visit?" "No." "Have you any money?" he next asked her, and she politely and speedily informed him that she had 50 cents. "You must tell me where you come from," came next from him in peremptory finger taps. "No, sir," she replied with spirited movements. "Then you'll stay here until you do," he responded, and with a yawn he rose, turned his back to her, and looked out the window. 'Tilda Jane took up her dog and slipped out of the room. She was not frightened or sorry for the deception she had just practiced. It did not seem to her that it was deception. For the time being she was deaf and dumb, and far from being alarmed by her helpless condition, she possessed the strong conviction that she would be well taken care of. She had also ceased to worry about the board of lady managers, and in her present comfortable, callous state of mind, she reflected that she might stay here a year, and they would never think of looking for her in a railway station. She was lost to them, and she gaily hummed a tune as she strolled to and fro on the big wooden platform, watching the shunting engines, the busy custom-house officers, and the station-yard employees, who were cleaning, rubbing, scouring, and preparing cars for further journeys. At 12 o'clock, just as she was beginning to stifle yawns and gaze wistfully at the windows of the dining-room, a young girl in a white apron came and stood in the doorway, and shading her eyes from the sun shining in such dazzling brightness on the snow, beckoned vigorously to 'Tilda Jane. The little girl needed no second invitation, and with her dog limping behind her, trotted nimbly toward her new friend. "Poor little soul, she's deef and dumb," said the dining-room girl compassionately, as she passed a group of men in the hall. "Ain't it a pity?" 'Tilda Jane did not speak or smile. Nor did her conscience, often so troublesomely sensitive, now give one reproving twinge, since, talking to the inspector, she felt as if deaf and dumb. She had been officially proclaimed so, and in meek patience she seated herself at the table, calmly pointed to what she wished, and being most tenderly and assiduously waited upon by the pitying girl, ate a large and excellent dinner. At the orphan asylum there had never been fare such as this, and after she had finished her chocolate pudding, and put in her pocket a juicy orange that she could not possibly eat, she bowed her head, and internally and thankfully repeated the orphanage grace after meat. "Just look at her!" exclaimed the admiring girl. "Ain't she cute? What kind of folks must she have to let such a poor little innocent travel alone? I don't believe she's obstinate. That assistant inspector is as hateful as he can be. Come, sissy, and I'll show you to your room." And she approached 'Tilda Jane and took her by the hand. The latter pointed to her dog, and not until she had seen him satisfy the demands of his appetite would she consent to follow her guide to a neat little apartment in the top of the wooden hotel. Upon arriving there, she thanked the girl by a smile, closed the door, and throwing herself on her bed, was soon buried in sweet and wholesome slumber. End of chapter 6. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 7 of Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 7. Clearing up a mistake. That evening, when some of the custom house officials and some of the guests of the hotel were sitting tipped back in chairs in the smoking room, the assistant inspector said to the inspector, who had just come in, "I couldn't make anything of your deaf and dumb kid, Jack." "What deaf and dumb kid?" asked Jack, seating himself and drawing out his cigar case. "That young one with the bundle. She ain't deaf and dumb. Her tongue's hung as limber as yours." "Well, I swan," said the assistant inspector, blankly, as he spoke. He brought his chair down on its four legs and gazed around the room with an expression of such utter helplessness that the other men broke into a roar of laughter. "Don't cry, Blakeman," said Jack soothingly. "It's only once in a coon's age you're fooled." "Do you suppose the sly boots has gone to bed?" asked Blakeman, again tipping back his chair and returning to his professional manner. "Uncle Sam hasn't got any spare cash to waste on such like. Just open the door, Rufus, and see if you can see any of the girls about." A dining-room girl good-naturedly consented to go in search of 'Tilda Jane, and upon entering the room found her on her knees, thoughtfully looking down at the railway tracks running close to the hotel. Stepping forward and gently touching her shoulder, the girl pointed downstairs. 'Tilda Jane nodded, smiled, and taking her hand, went out into the hall and down the staircases with her. 'Tilda Jane stared at the ring of men sitting in the smoking room. When she caught sight of her friend of the morning, she smiled and bobbed her head at him. Then, letting her dog slip from her arm to the floor, she stood in silence, waiting to be questioned. She had no doubt that this was some special tribunal called together to deliberate upon her case. She was not afraid of these men. They had kindly faces. "What made you pretend you were deaf and dumb?" asked the inspector at last. She opened her mouth once or twice, tried to speak, failed, and at last articulated with difficulty and with an air of genuine surprise, "Why, ain't I deef and dumb? I ain't spoke ever since he made me think so, till now," and she nodded toward the assistant inspector. "I made you think so?" ejaculated Blakeman irritably. "Yes, sir," she said dreamily, and lingering over her syllables as if she found a new pleasure in the exercise of speech. "You had so much to say, and the other people had so much to say, that the room seemed chock full of words. They was flying round ever so thick, but I couldn't ketch one of them." "Well, now you've got to quit lying, and tell us where you come from," said the assistant inspector roughly. "You've got to be sent home to-morrow." "Sent home?" she repeated wonderingly. "Yes, to Canada. Now tell us the name of the place you belong to, or we'll ship you to some poorhouse." "Do I come from Canada?" she asked, with a mystified air. Jack jogged his assistant's elbow. "Seemed to me there was the smell of a ship about her." "Not so," responded Blakeman, who prided himself on distinguishing nationalities. "She hasn't any European accent. She's from right over the border here somewhere." "Do you know my mother?" Tilda Jane was eagerly asking the assistant inspector. "Yes, know her well." "If you don't speak up, I'll telegraph her." "Oh, I'll never speak then," said 'Tilda Jane, taking a step forward and clasping her hands painfully. "Oh, sir, do telegraph to my mother. I've cried and cried at nights 'bout her. Other girls has mothers that loves 'em and strokes their hair, and nobody ever done that to me. They just thinks I'm ugly. Oh, sir, won't you telegraph my mother?" Blakeman had gone too far. The sentiment of the meeting was against him, and a low murmur warned him to retract what he had said. "I don't mean your mother," he said sulkily. "I mean your guardians." "The lady boards?" asked 'Tilda Jane eagerly. He did not know what lady boards meant, but his silence seemed to give assent to her question, and losing the bright flush that had come to her face, she relapsed into painful and profound silence. He would never know how he had hurt her. Oh, what hopes he had raised, and in an instant dashed to the ground, and checking the convulsion in her throat, she stealthily wiped away the 2 tears of distress coursing down her thin cheeks. "Don't cry," said Jack kindly. "I expect you're tired from your trip in the train yesterday. You had a pretty long one, hadn't you?" "Yes, Mr. Jack," she said humbly. "It seemed kind of long, but I'm not used to being drug along so mighty quick." "I didn't notice her till we passed McAdam Junction," whispered Jack to his assistant. "She came down from some place in New Brunswick. Telegraph McAdam." "They'll not know," growled Blakeman. "Robinson on yesterday's Montreal express is the man. He'll be back tonight. He'll know where she got on. If he'd reported, 'twould have saved this." "I guess he didn't think we'd struck such an obstacle," remarked Jack with a chuckle. Then he said aloud, "Don't you suppose they'll be worrying about you, sissy?" "No, sir," she said meekly. "They'll be more mad than worried." "You haven't lost that paper with the address, have you?" said Jack cunningly. "No, sir," and she put her hand to her breast. He got up and walked toward her. "Let me see if I can read it." "There's no 'casion for that," she said with dignity. "You'll have to let me see it," he said firmly, so firmly that It being no part of her plan to dare the undareable, she quietly handed Hank's card to him. Hobart Dillson, Ciscasset, Maine, he read. Then he gave it back to her. Thank you, Sissy. I guess you can go to bed now. In a minute, said 'Tilda Jane submissively, while she made a queer bob of a curtsy to all present. Gentlemen all, before I go I must say something. Upstairs just now I was pondering on my wickedness. I guess you think I don't know that all liars has their portion in the lake o' fire and brimstone. I knows it and feels it, but, gentlemen, I ain't told no more lies nor I could help. That 'bout bein' deef and dumb I can't call a lie, 'cause I felt it, and I'm s'prised now to hear myself talk, but I have told lies, and I know it. Today I had a boss dinner. I went to sleep, and on my bed I dreamed. Something roared and shook the house, and I woke in a sweat. Did I think the devil had come after me? Yes, sirs, gentlemen, I've been awful bad. I don't s'pose any of you knows what such badness is. I'm afeard I've got to go on lying till I like lies better'n truth. That's what ladies I has known said would happen to little girls as stepped aside from the paths of righteousness. The men were all staring at her, the assistant inspector most intently, for this flow of language for the supposedly deaf and dumb child surprised even him, a man used to surprises. I'm going to repent some day, continued 'Tilda Jane sadly, just as soon as I get out of this and enjoyin' family life. I'm going to repent of all 'cept one thing, and I can't repent 'bout that 'cause I don't know if it's wrong. Do you like dogs? And she abruptly addressed the assistant inspector. No, he said brusquely. What do you like? She went on wistfully. Cats? Birds? Children? Do you like girls, sir? Nice little girls with blue eyes and curly hair? The assistant inspector was a remarkably fine, blond specimen of a man, and he was popular among the young women of the neighborhood. 'Tilda Jane's artless question produced a burst of laughter from his companions and a furious flaming of color in his own face. Her question had gone home, and she proceeded, Suppose you had a nice little girl, and someone wanted to take her away, and frighten her, and tie jingling things to her, and make her run, and you'd catch her up and run off to the woods. Would that be awful wicked, do you s'pose? And would you have to repent? The assistant inspector preserved a discreet and resentful silence, but two or three of his companions murmured between their pipe stems and their lips. Not much he wouldn't. Now that's what troubles me, 'Tilda Jane continued. The rest is bad, but is that bad? I guess I'll have to ask some minister, and gentlemen all, I guess you'd better let me go on to Ciscasset. You've got a nice place here and plenty of things to eat, and I think you're very fair, but I feel like moving on, and pausing, she anxiously scanned the row of faces about her. Run away to bed now, said Jack. We'll tell you tomorrow what you're to do, and as 'Tilda Jane picked up her pet and disappeared, he sauntered across the room, took up a telegraph form, and addressed a message to the Creamery Shark's father. Hobart Dillson, Ciscasset. Girl, age 12. Dark hair, eyes. Run away from place unknown. Going to your address. Held as emigrant without means. Refuses to give name. Can you supply any information? Answer paid for. End of chapter 7. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 8 of 'Tilda Jane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Tilda Jane by Marshall Saunders. Chapter 8. A Third Running Away. "Look here, little girl," said Jack, stopping 'Tilda Jane as she was coming out of the dining room the next morning. "I've had a telegram from your friend in Ciscasset." "And what does he say?" she asked breathlessly. "I'll read it," and he drew a paper from his pocket. "Never heard of girl. Don't want her. Hobart Dillson." 'Tilda Jane looked crestfallen, but did not flinch in face of the new difficulty. "He's a cranky old man. He'll be all right when I talk to him." "Well, you're a queer fish," muttered her friend, as by way of hiding her chagrin she went quickly upstairs. "We can't do anything with you till Robinson gets back and tells us where he picked you up." The assistant inspector met her in the hall above. "Have you made up your mind to talk yet?" he asked austerely. 'Tilda Jane shook her head. "I've been amusing myself by telegraphing along the line," he said in the same tone of voice. "None of the stations know anything about you, and the agent at McAdam has started off in the woods for his holidays. The conductor that brought you is laid up from an accident to his train, so you've got to speak for yourself. And do you know what I've made up my mind to do?" "No, sir," she said steadily. "By tonight, if you won't tell me where you come from, I'm going to take that dog away from you." Her face turned a sickly yellow, but she did not quail. "You wouldn't shoot him, would you?" "No, I won't shoot him," he said deliberately. "I guess I'd give him to some nice little girl who wouldn't tell lies." 'Tilda Jane's head sank on her breast. "Give me till tomorrow morning, sir. I'd like to think it over." "I'll see about it," he said, with a curious glance at her. Then he went away. 'Tilda Jane knew that he would give her till the morning. She would not be troubled by him all day. She would have time to think. The worst difficulty in her experience confronted her. She would lose her dog in any case. To speak was to be sent back to the asylum. To remain silent was to let her Gippy become the cherished darling of some other girl. And in mute agony she caressed the smooth brown head and put her hand before the almost sightless eyes, as if she would hide from them even a suspicion of coming danger. Mr. Jack had just stepped on one of the outgoing trains. She could not appeal to him, and the table girls, since they had found that she was a storyteller, slighted her in a most marked way. She wandered downstairs and out of doors. All day she loitered about the station platform, watching the trains come in, deliberate freight trains with their loads of merchandise, all to be examined by the busy customs officials, and rushing express trains with their hundreds of hungry passengers who swept in crowds into the spacious dining room. She saw her companions in captivity borne away. The fashionable lady got on a train that was entering Canada, and the dismal boy and girl followed her. The little German Jew, who had been roaming about the hotel like a restless ghost, always with his hat on and a bundle in his hand, as if he wished to impress all beholders with the fact that he was only tarrying for a short time, had, on the receipt of a telegram informing the inspectors that he had merely forgotten his papers, become a happy maniac. He ran to and fro. He collected his bundles, dropped them, to kiss the hand of a table girl who gave him some cakes for his lunch, and had to be restrained by main force from boarding every train that pulled up to the station. Fortunate travelers and unfortunate orphan. She could not get on one of the trains and be borne away. She was watched. She felt it, for she had now a perfect comprehension of the system of espionage established over unsuspecting travellers. The rich and the well-dressed ones were passed by unless they were wearing sealskin wraps. The poor and penniless must give an account of themselves, so there was no escape for her by train. She must take to the road. She had better go lie down and try to sleep, she reflected with a shudder, as she had now before her the prospect of another night in the woods. As soon as it got dark, she must try to slip away from the hotel. At 6 o'clock, she had had her nap and was in her favorite spot on her knees by her open window. Night was approaching, and she felt neither sorry nor frightened nor apprehensive. The sun was going down, and she was so completely wrapped in deep and silent content that she could neither speak nor think. She did not know that she was an ardent lover of nature, that her whole soul was at the present moment so filled with the glory of the winter evening that she had no room for her own troubles. The clanging supper bell disturbed her, and with a sigh and a look of longing farewell at the sky, she closed the window and made her way to the dining room. After supper she returned to her post, and as she could not now see the glorious sky and the snowy fields, she let her attention fall upon the trains below that had begun to have a strange fascination for her. She had lost all fear of them by this time, and had even begun to notice that there were differences in them, just as there were differences in people. Some were big and bulky, others were quick and dashing. Some had hoarse voices, some clear ones. The Canadian engines coming in shrieked in one tone. The American ones, passing them from the other direction, replied in another. Hour after hour went by, and with the time her sense of dreamy contentment faded away. It gave her but little dismay to look out into the starlit night and fancy herself alone in snowy solitudes. But it gave her considerable dismay to look down below and find that the hotel was neither getting dark nor perfectly quiet, as she fancied all well-regulated houses did at night. She had forgotten that they could not sleep here. At least everybody could not. Trains were coming and going all the time, and with this constant supervision below, how could she evade detection? Number 17 is an hour late, and getting later every minute, she heard someone call after a time. Bad snowdrifts up north. Guess I'll take a wink of sleep, a tired voice responded. There'll be nothing but freights for a spell, and then followed comparative silence. Footsteps were only occasionally heard. Fewer lights flashed in the distance, and it was only at much longer intervals that passing trains shook the house. There was a lull in the constant noises, and now was the time for action. She rose stealthily and took her dog in her arms, a pathetic child figure no longer, but a wary, stealthy little elf, endeavoring to escape from danger threatened by these larger and more powerful human beings. Her sleeping room was a tiny chamber opening out on one occupied by two of the dining room girls. She was not afraid of their waking. She had heard them say, as they undressed, that they had to get up at 4:30 to iron tablecloths and napkins, and there was not an instant's interruption of their heavy, dreamless slumber as she stole noiselessly by them. Now for the staircase. She paused anxiously at the top and looked down. There was no one in sight, and holding her breath and tiptoeing cautiously, she stole down step by step. At last she was at the bottom of both flights of stairs. So far, so good. And she laid her hand on the knob of the front door that was never locked. But stop! Let her pause. There were sounds outside. Someone out there hesitated, halted, and remarked to some other person behind, "Will you come in and have a bite of something to eat?" Tilda Jane scarcely dared to breathe, and gazing down the hall behind her, shook in her substantial shoes. She could see the office at the end of the hall, and the sleepy clerk napping at his desk. If she retreated toward him, he might wake up and discover her, and if the men entered, she could not possibly avoid being caught by them. In intense anxiety, she awaited results. There were only a few seconds of uncertainty. Then her heart gave a bound of thankfulness. The footsteps had passed on, and only waiting till they died away, she opened the door and glided through. Now she was on a brightly lighted platform at the mercy of any passer-by, or any wakeful person who might be at one of the hotel windows. She made one swift rush across it, one leap over the railway tracks, and with a stifled exclamation of thankfulness, found herself on the village road. Like a dark, diminutive ghost, she sped up the hill past the silent houses. Now she was comparatively safe, yet which way should she go? She was completely puzzled. Yet she had a vague idea that there were great forests surrounding Vanceboro, for she had heard the men at the hotel talk of fishing and shooting. Trembling in every limb from excitement, and pressing her precious bundle closely to her, she took a road to the left. She must not go to the right, for across the river was Canada, and if she got into that foreign country again, she would have fresh difficulties in returning to her own native one. She would press on through the village, take to the woods, and trust to luck to find some house where she could ask the way to Ciscasset. There was a moon tonight, an old pale moon, and it cast a tremulous light over the soft white fields sloping down to the St. Croix River, the sleeping village, and the brightly lighted station yard in the hollow. She turned around, took one farewell glance at the habitations of men, and plunged into the winding road leading into the heart of the forest. Hour after hour she plodded on. This reminded her of her walk with Ruth Ann 2 evenings before. Only here there was more light, the snow was deeper, and the trees were not as high as those on the way to the Moss Glen station. She hoped with a shiver that she should meet no wild beasts. Hark! What was that crashing through the alder bushes? She stopped short, clasped her dog to her breast, and looked about for some means of defense. Nothing offered but a dry tree branch, and she was just bending over to seize it when there rushed by her so quickly that she had no time to be afraid an object that caused a faint smile of pleasure to come to her pale lips. This was a large deerhound running along with his nose to the snow, and he paid no more attention to her than if she had been one of the stumps by the side of the road. "Here, doggy, doggy," she called wistfully, but he did not return, and startled by the sound of her voice in the intense stillness, she hastily resumed her way. How solemn the moon was, staring down at her with that section of a face on which she fancied she saw an ear, the corner of a mouth, and one terrible glistening eye. Little girl, where are you going? Are you doing right? Are you not a naughty little girl? I can't think about it now, she said desperately. When I get settled down, I'll square things up. Anyway, I'm not afraid for the fun of it. Law me, ain't this road long? Here, Gippy, I guess you might walk a few steps. Keep in my tracks, and I'll not let anything hurt you. If a bear comes, he'll eat me first. It'll do you good to stretch your legs a mite. Away back to the hotel, Mr. Jack was just getting home. We can let our deaf and dumb kid go in the morning, he said to his assistant, who got on the train as he left it. The waitress at Macadam was just inquiring about her. Says she's U.S. all right. Came from Moss Glen Station. Didn't know Ciscasset when she got to it, and was carried on. Agent forgot to speak to Robinson about her, and the waitress wanted to know if she got through all right. U.S., grumbled the assistant inspector, pausing with his foot on the steps of the baggage car. Why didn't she say so? Was frightened. I guess she'd run away. A case of innocence abroad. Well, we can't hold her if she isn't an immigrant, said Blakeman, with relief. Let her go. They've got a poorhouse in Ciscasset, I suppose. She'll go in no poorhouse, said Mr. Jack with a chuckle. She's too smart. If he could have seen at that moment the weary little figure toiling along the forest road, he would have uttered the appreciative adjective with even more energy. Tired, hungry, occasionally stooping to lift a handful of snow to her lips, 'Tilda Jane plodded on. Her thin figure was bent from fatigue. She had again picked up the wailing dog, and had slung him on her back in the shawl. Yet there was not the slightest indication of faltering in her aspect. There were no clearings in the woods, no promise of settlement. Yet her face was ever toward the promised land of Ciscasset, and her back to the place of captivity in Vanceboro. End of chapter 8. Recording by John Brandon.